Henry David Thoreau was born in New England on the east coast of the United States in 1817. His paternal grandfather had emigrated to America from Jersey in the Channel Islands, and his mother's family had links back to Scotland. Henry Thoreau was the third of 4 children. He had an older sister and an older brother, Helen and John, and a younger sister, Sophia. Friends of the family remembered Henry's mother, Cynthia Thoreau, as a lively, talkative woman who was particularly kind to young people, and from an early age encouraged her children to enjoy rambling in the fields and woods around the town of Concord, Massachusetts, where they lived. Of the 4 children, Henry Thoreau showed the greatest aptitude for intellectual pursuits. He was curious about everything and a voracious reader, and the family made a great effort to send him to Harvard College. However, Henry was not only a gifted scholar. He was a lover of nature, and from his boyhood he had developed a kinship with the plants, animals, birds, fish, rivers, and lakes around his home. He was also fascinated by the tribespeople who had formerly inhabited New England, and he seems to have felt an affinity with them and their way of life from an early age. A friend recollected that, before leaving college, Thoreau asked his mother what profession she thought he should choose. She replied, a little sharply perhaps, "Why, you can buckle on your knapsack and roam abroad to seek your fortune." Tears came into Henry's eyes and began to trickle down his cheeks, and his older sister Helen put her arm round him and said, "No, Henry, you shall not go. You shall stay at home and live with us." Accordingly, after graduating from college, Henry Thoreau obtained a teaching post at the Concord Public School. However, he resigned after a few weeks, after a dispute with the director, who wished him to administer corporal punishment to insubordinate children, which Thoreau refused to do. Next, he and John Thoreau opened a grammar school in Concord. There was no corporal punishment, and lessons included walks in the woods and visits to local businesses. But Henry Thoreau did not seem to have enjoyed the experience. Later, he wrote that, "As I did not teach for the good of my fellow men, but simply for a living, this was a failure." In 1839, during one of the school holidays, Henry went on a 2-week boating trip with his brother, who also seems to have been his closest friend. In a wooden boat that they made themselves, they paddled away down the Concord and Merrimack rivers, and every night Henry recorded the day's events in his journal, which he had begun to keep when he left college. The Concord River, also known by its Indian name, the Musketaquid, or Grass-Ground River, had formerly been abundantly filled with fish, but dams and canals and factories built along its banks had reduced their numbers, particularly of American shad, which, like salmon, swim out to the open sea, but return to their birthplace to spawn. "Perhaps," wrote Thoreau, "after a few thousands of years, if the fishes will be patient and pass their summers elsewhere, nature will have levelled the Billerica Dam and the Lowell factories, and the Grass-Ground River will run clear again to be explored by new migratory shoals." "Poor shad," he went on to write, "where is thy redress? When nature gave the instinct, gave she the heart to bear thy fate? Still wandering the sea in thy scaly armour, to inquire humbly at the mouths of the rivers if man has perchance left them free for thee to enter, armed with no sword, no electric shock, but mere shad, armed only with innocence and a just cause, with tender dumb mouth only forward, and scales easy to be detached. Thou shalt ere long have thy way up the rivers, up all the rivers of the globe, if I am not mistaken. Yea, even thy dull water dream shall be more than realized. If it were not so, but thou wert to be overlooked at first and at last, then would not I take their heaven." 3 years after this trip, which later Thoreau would describe in his first book, A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, John Thoreau fell ill and died. Henry cared for his brother through his brief illness, and afterwards he seems to have been unable to carry on as before. He closed the school which they had started together, and spent some time working with his father. John Thoreau Sr. owned a small pencil-making factory, and Henry helped him to perfect the method of grinding the graphite and improve the composition of the leads. At this time, Henry was living in the home of the Emerson family. Since his return from college, he had been befriended by some of the writers and thinkers who had settled in Concord, and the most famous of these was Ralph Waldo Emerson. Materially well off himself, Emerson was able to offer assistance to aspiring writers and idealists, and for 3 years he gave Thoreau a home beneath his roof, employing him as a tutor to his children and as a handyman about the house, for Henry excelled at working with his hands and performing odd jobs. Another friend of Thoreau's, who also lived in Concord, was the philosopher Bronson Alcott, father of the children's author Louisa May Alcott. Unlike Emerson, Alcott was always struggling to support himself and his wife and 4 daughters, for he refused to do work which he believed to be unethical. Many of his neighbours were extremely critical of his impractical ways, but writing about him in later years, Thoreau described him as one of the last of the philosophers. He is perhaps the sanest man, and has the fewest crotchets of any I chance to know, the same yesterday and tomorrow. Of yore we had sauntered and talked, and effectually put the world behind us, for he was pledged to no institutions in it, free-born, ingenuous. Whichever way we turned, it seemed that the heavens and the earth had met together, since he enhanced the beauty of the landscape. A blue-robed man, whose fittest roof is the overarching sky, which reflects his serenity. From Thoreau, who was disappointed by so many of his contemporaries, this was praise indeed. Like Thoreau, Alcott had been a schoolteacher, but he had been dismissed because he had allowed a little black girl to study with his other pupils. This experience probably intensified his deep unhappiness with the society in which he lived. Industrialization, slavery, modern educational methods, land ownership, and even keeping domestic animals were all abhorrent to Bronson Alcott. And in 1841, he decided to found a utopian community. As he had no money, he enlisted the aid of a British man called Charles Lane, and they purchased 100 acres of land not far from Concord, which they called Fruitlands. They wished to be completely self-sufficient, so luxuries like coffee, tea, and sugar were forbidden. They kept no animals, so there was no milk or meat, and all the farming was to be done by the residents, without the use of oxen or horses. They wore no wool, because it came from sheep, and they refused to buy cotton, because it was produced using the slave labour of the southern states. In all there were 13 members, one of whom was Abby May Alcott, Bronson Alcott's wife, as well as Charles Lane's son and the 4 little Alcott girls. The experiment proved to be an unqualified disaster. The residents quarrelled with each other. Bronson's wife and daughters resented the repressive rules, which they never really agreed to, and they were unable to grow enough food to sustain themselves. After 7 months, at the beginning of 1843, the community broke up, and although Bronson Alcott still believed in the need for a better, kinder society, he was forced to return to Concord with his family. Henry Thoreau had witnessed his friend's endeavour, and even though he had declined to take part in it, its failure must have made an impression on him, for he was coming to a crisis in his own affairs. His brother had passed away. He had asked a young woman to marry him and had been rejected. Her father had forbidden the match, probably because, as a minister, he disapproved of Henry's refusal to go to church. He had found that he disliked being a schoolteacher, and he did not enjoy working in his father's pencil factory. In 1845 he renounced his partnership in the business, and went to live in a hut in the woods, on some land belonging to Ralph Waldo Emerson, beside a lake called Walden Pond. Many of the residents of Concord deeply disapproved of this decision, but Henry wrote that, "The greater part of what my neighbours call good, I believe in my soul to be bad, and if I repent of anything, it is very likely to be my good behaviour." His reason for going to live in the woods was simple. "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately," he wrote, "to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived." Thoreau built himself a little wooden house, just big enough for his bed, a fireplace, a table, his writing desk, and chairs for himself and 1 or 2 visitors. Outside the house he ploughed up an area of land and sowed it with beans, which he hoed by hand throughout the summer. Like Bronson Alcott, he did without tea and coffee and sugar, nor did he have any domestic animals. However, as he lived alone, he was not obliged to impose these choices upon others, but instead showed by example that it was possible to live simply and happily, without the hard work and many luxuries which people believed to be necessary. Henry Thoreau and the rest of the Thoreau family were abolitionists, who often gave assistance to fugitive slaves trying to make their way north. But one of Thoreau's most interesting observations is that the self-imposed slavery he saw amongst his neighbours was as bad, if not worse, than the legal slavery of the South. "It is hard to have a southern overseer," he wrote. "It is worse to have a northern one, but worst of all when you are the slave driver of yourself. The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. What is called resignation is confirmed desperation. From the desperate city you go into the desperate country and have to console yourself with the bravery of minks and muskrats." In the wood, Thoreau was living amongst minks, muskrats, woodchucks, hares, and many birds, including redstarts, whippoorwills, owls, bluebirds, loons, and the Little Dipper. The Harivamsa, an Indian scripture, says, "An abode without birds is like a meat without seasoning." Such was not my abode, wrote Thoreau, for I find myself suddenly neighbour to the birds, not by having imprisoned one, but having caged myself near them. As well as reading and writing the journal, which would later become the basis for his most famous book, Walden, Thoreau worked hard on his bean patch, proving to himself, and anyone who was interested, that it was possible to grow enough to satisfy one's own needs without the need for hired workers or domestic animals. "I learned from the experience of both years that if one would live simply and need only the crop which he raised, and raise no more than he ate, and not exchange it for an insufficient quantity of more luxurious and expensive things, he would need to cultivate only a few rods of ground, and that it would be cheaper to spade up that than to use oxen to plough it, and he could do all his necessary farm work, as it were, with his left hand at odd hours in the summer, and thus he would not be tied to an ox, or horse, or cow, or pig as at present." Although Thoreau seems to have been on friendly terms with many of the local farmers, valuing their practical knowledge and experience, he poured scorn on a system of land management that was driven purely by a desire for profit. He took particular exception to a farmer, by that time dead many years, who had given his name to a small lake called Flint's Pond, not far from Thoreau's little hut. Flint's Pond! What right had the unclean and stupid farmer, whose farm abutted on this sky water, whose shores he had ruthlessly laid bare, to give his name to it? I go not there to see him, nor to hear of him, who never saw it, who never bathed in it, who never loved it, who never protected it, who never spoke a good word for it, nor thanked God that he had made it. Rather, let it be named from the fishes that swim in it, the wild fowl or quadrupeds which frequent it, the wild flowers which grow by its shores, or some wild man or child, the thread of whose history is interwoven with his own. Not from him who could show no title to it, but the deed which a like-minded neighbour or legislature gave him. I respect not his labours, his farm where everything has its price, who would carry the landscape, who would carry his God to market, if he could get anything for him, on whose farm nothing grows free, whose fields bear no crops, whose meadows no flowers, whose trees bear no fruit but dollars, who loves not the beauty of his fruits, whose fruits are not ripe for him till they are turned to dollars. Give me the poverty that enjoys true wealth. During Thoreau's time living in the woods, he received many visits from the residents of Concord, curious to see how he was contriving to live alone, 1.5 miles from the village, and also from friends like the poet Ellery Channing, a local farmer called Edmund Hosmer, and Bronson Alcott, who even in winter would walk through the darkness and snow and rain to spend an evening sitting talking to his old friend. The Thoreaus were also frequent visitors, coming to call most Saturday afternoons. Henry himself did not neglect his family responsibilities during his stay in the woods, and returned home most days to tend the family garden and assist his elderly father in the business. In return, it seems that his mother and sisters helped him with the washing and mending of his clothes. With the death of their eldest son, Cynthia and John Thoreau and their unmarried daughters were particularly reliant on Henry for support, and after 2 years in the woods, Thoreau returned to his home in Concord. He earned a living working as a land surveyor, and also gave lectures and wrote essays and articles, as well as 2 books, the first describing his boat trip down the Concord and Merrimack rivers, the second his 2 years living the simplest life possible on the shores of Walden Pond. In his lifetime neither book sold at all well, but not long after his death in 1862, The second book, called simply Walden, began to be more widely read and more highly respected. In Walden, Thoreau himself wrote, "I would not have anyone adopt my mode of living on any account, for beside that before he has fairly learned it, I may have found out another for myself. I desire that there may be as many different persons in the world as possible, but I would have each one be very careful to find out and pursue his own way, and not his father's or his mother's or his neighbour's instead." Thoreau's experiment in simple living has been a source of inspiration for people ever since Walden was first published, and one of his final reflections continues to strike a chord. "I learned this at least by my experiment, that if one advances confidently in the direction of his dreams, and endeavours to live the life which he has imagined, he will meet with a success unexpected in common hours. He will put some things behind, will pass an invisible boundary, new, universal and liberal laws will begin to establish themselves around and within him, or the old laws be expanded and interpreted in his favour in a more liberal sense, and he will live with the licence of a higher order of beings."